Senator Roberts.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. As a servant to the people of Queensland and Australia, I want to make comments on the bill, the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation Amendment Bill 2019. Let me first say that in support of Senator Hanson's decision to not vote on legislation other than critical legislation until the government has addressed the plight of dairy farmers, and so I will not be voting on this bill. Firstly, though, some background comments. Let's get to the basics. Housing affordability is deteriorating due to the high prices of housing, the exorbitantly high prices of housing. We are experiencing the world's greatest ever resources boom, yet young people in Australia, young Australians, cannot afford homes. Under Liberal Labor governments, electricity prices have gone from the world's lowest to the world's highest. And that is due entirely to UN policies that the Greens drive, Labor adopts, and the Liberals follow. Under Liberal Labor governments, tax has become a convoluted mess that is crippling and drives counterproductive behaviours across society. According to a New South Wales housing industry body, tax accounts for almost half the cost of a new house. Let me quote from housing and other industry bodies that were cited in the Sunday Telegraph article of 15th February 2014. That might seem like some time ago, but it foreshadows the current mess. It was also predictable. The article is titled, Mr Acting Deputy President, "Nearly half the cost of a new house is gobbled up by a range of hidden taxes and can add up to $250,000 per property." It was written by Tim McIntyre, the real estate reporter for the Sunday Telegraph. The taxes make up 44% of the price of a property, with the extra cost being blamed on a shortfall of new housing in Sydney. Most people are aware of things like stamp duty, but not the hidden taxes in housing, said Stephen Kirshner, Research Fellow at the Centre for Independent Studies. The added tax can make the price unaffordable. Mr Kirshner said the tax burden was contributing to a dwelling supply shortfall in New South Wales, tipped to reach a deficit of 55,000 houses in 2014, according to QBE Insurance Group's report, Australian Housing Outlook 2013-16. A Centre for International Economics report found that taxes accounted for 268,000 of the average total dwelling cost of $640,000. Government taxes are forcing developers out of the market, said Peter Icklow, CEO of developer Monarch Investments. He says, I'm selling house and land packages for $500,000 each and then paying the government $50,000 for each settlement. That's after paying taxes all the way through the development process. So Mr Icklow said the introduction of the GST on settlements had all but crippled many developers. In addition to the GST, the hidden taxes severely affected the viability of developments. So too, a husband and wife, Glenn and Pi Ferguson, recently bought in the Ingleburn Gardens estate at Bardia in Sydney's southwest. The affordability of a house and land there compared with their former suburb of Sutherland convinced them to move, but they were unaware that 44% of the price was taxes. I had absolutely no idea, said Mr Ferguson. It's definitely something that needs to be addressed. We need more affordable properties. So personal taxes are also high, and that leaves little room for saving. And then governments waste our money. This is so infuriating for taxpayers. Last May, 5 months ago, I was in Mount Isa and I bought something at Woolies, and a middle-aged lady supervising the Woolies automatic checkout in Mount Isa said she works 2 jobs, sometimes 3. She was staggered with the level of tax in this country. Worse, she was disappointed with Canberra's politicians wasting money. It just alarmed her and frustrated her and angered her. Thirdly, we have unbridled and excessive immigration driving house prices through the roof. So we have an increase in house prices, a decrease in people's ability to afford houses through energy and tax and many other factors. Then let me dwell on a few other things that gouge people and hurt people and suppress people. We have the UN's Lima Declaration that Gough Whitlam's Labor government signed in 1975 and that Malcolm Fraser's Liberal Nationals government ratified the following year in 1976. That destroyed manufacturing and incomes. A friend of mine gave me 3 plastic bags, not the sort of plastic bags that the Labor Party uses to collect cash, but there was in fact an Aldi bag made in Germany. There was a Woolies bag made in Thailand. And there was a Coles bag made in Malaysia. We don't make cars here anymore. Value-adding industries are being exported. Jobs are being exported. Then we have in 1992 the UN's Rio de Janeiro Declaration for 21st Century Global Governance that Paul Keating's Labor government signed and that the Liberals have since implemented. We have the 1996 UN's Kyoto Protocol, to which John Howard's Liberal government, national government, committed to fulfill. They said they would fulfill the commitments under the Kyoto Protocol for the UN. And subsequently, the Labor government under Kevin Rudd, signed it. And then we have the infamous UN's 2015 Paris Agreement. I have in my office a copy of some 7,000 bilateral and multilateral treaties to which our Liberal Labor governments have signed us as of the 1990s. Heaven knows how many have been signed since then. Does anyone know? UN policies, agreements, protocols, declarations, treaties are killing our country's productive capacity and making housing unaffordable. And then we have the housing land stock that is under state and federal government control. And high regulation, and that they withhold land, and that drives up the price of land. And added to that is high regulation in this country that adds tens of thousands of dollars to the price of a home. Liberal Labor governments are failing the young, failing farmers and rural communities, failing the middle class. So Liberal Labor have been reluctant to manage and constrain the banks, as the Royal Commission recently showed so clearly. We need competition in banking. We need a people's bank that worked so successfully from 1912 to 1923 until it started to be dismantled by successive Liberal Labor governments. That was the Commonwealth Bank, a people's bank. It was killed because it was effective in providing competition to the private banks, just as is the case now in the state-owned North Dakota Bank, which provides loans to farmers, small businesses and individuals, and is one of the only banks, I think it might be the only bank in North America that has made a profit every year of its existence. The basics, Mr. Acting Deputy Presidents, are in a mess for housing. So what did we happen then? The government didn't address the mess, the basics. The government, as part of its 2017-18 budget, established the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation. And this was recognition, supposedly, that greater private and institutional investment is needed to expand the community housing sector and provide more Australians with access to affordable rental housing. Let's put on a Band-Aid or life support without addressing the basics. The National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation operates the Australian Housing Bond Aggregator to provide lower cost and longer-term finance for community housing providers by aggregating their borrowing requirements and issuing bonds into the wholesale market at a lower cost and longer term than traditional bank finance. Because the government is doing it, there is less perceived risk to the investment, and so the government enables lower interest rates. But in doing this, it transfers risks from purchasers of bonds to the government, or rather, more accurately, to the taxpayer. The benefits of accessing finance more efficiently will allow, so the government says, community housing providers to reinvest into expanding the supply of affordable housing. This will, so they say, help to improve outcomes for social housing and homelessness. Now, Mr. Acting Deputy President, the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation also administers the $1 billion National Housing Infrastructure Fund. The National Housing Infrastructure Fund will provide the $1 billion to support local governments through a range of options to finance critical infrastructure designed to expand housing supply through, for example, special purpose grants for spending on such as transport links, power and water infrastructure and site remediation works. This pair of initiatives has only been underway since March when the corporation's executives were appointed. And now we have a third part of the package, guarantees to improve home ownership. The guarantees provided by the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation on eligible loans will be equal to the difference between the deposit, which is at least 5%, and 20% of the property purchase price. This will drive the price of houses so high that those young people and parents who did the right thing, who saved, and parents who went as guarantors for their children, who did the right thing will pay more for housing because it will drive up housing prices. Secondly, an annual cap of 10,000 guarantees issued leading to 50,000 houses over the 5-year forward estimates. Leading to 50,000 houses being guaranteed, I should say. Thirdly, eligibility requirements for applicants include that the applicant must be a first home buyer, be an Australian citizen purchasing property in Australia, and satisfy an income test. Taxable incomes up to $125,000 per annum for singles and up to $200,000 per annum for couples earned in the previous year. And fourthly, eligibility requirements for loans, where a loan is eligible if the residential property will be owner-occupied and the purchase price of the property is less than the price cap that applies in the area where the property is located. These regional price caps will be set with a view to ensuring, so the government says, equitable access to the scheme across Australia. This is unknown at this time. It's an unknown future regulation. So let's look at what the Bills Committee had to say about this. The Bills Committee objects to this legislation on the basis that all the rules around the actual operation of the guarantee scheme will be non-disallowable legislative instruments. As such, there is no parliamentary security on this scheme. How can we accept that? We can't. Further, those rules are not provided with the bill. So we are voting to set up a scheme that we do not know how it will operate and over which we will have no supervision. What could possibly go wrong, Mr. Acting Deputy President? And then let's have a look at big ticket policy. Let's calculate a simple understanding of the cost of guaranteeing the purchase of homes. 10,000 homes a year, remember, over forward estimates of 15 years, that's 50,000 homes. Average price of a house is 600,000, say. Difference between 5% and 20%, which is what the government is guaranteeing, is 15% of 600,000, which is $90,000, times 50,000 owners. That's a $4.5 billion of taxpayers' money at risk. The Australian housing, I'll say it again, that's $4.5 billion of taxpayers' money at risk. The Australian Housing Bond Aggregator issues bonds backed by mortgages and then lends that money to builders to build more low-cost housing. As such, the Australian House Building Aggregator, Bond Aggregator is on the hook for a reduction in the performance of those mortgages, which is also tied to housing valuations. By 2021, the Australian Housing Bond Aggregator expects to be holding $1.25 billion in housing finance bonds. Is there a limit, Mr. Acting Deputy President, to how much the government will go to keep the housing bubble going? What about the administration costs? Well, the administration cost is $25 million over the 5-year forward estimates. This distorts the market. This whole bill distorts the market. The federal Liberal government's liability is just going to keep going up and up and up under this system, both in guarantees and construction bonds through the Australian Housing Bond Aggregator. By tying the federal government up with a direct financial exposure to the housing market, it is building in a fail-safe that no matter what happens, the federal government cannot allow or afford the market to crash. This feels like the government is putting a safety net in place for a potential looming property crash. Homes that fall below mortgage value can be moved over to this scheme so that the federal government gives banks a 15% buffer and prevents foreclosure. If values fall even further in a wider or deeper crash, then the effect of this will be for the federal government to wear 15% of the original valuation of each property as a straight-up financial loss, so the banks don't have to. It's nice, isn't it, if you're a bank? What the actual effect will be is to sustain irresponsible lending by the banks, knowing that they are not wearing the risk the federal government is, the taxpayer is. In turn, that holds up values in an environment where the direction should be actually downward, driven by falling affordability, falling demand. Perhaps, Mr. Acting Deputy President, this bill should be called the Keep the Housing Bubble Going a Bit Longer bill and make the federal government, the taxpayer, pay for the crash bill of 2019. I trust nothing about this. People can either afford a house or people can't. Government intervention just makes housing more unaffordable, not less. It'll drive the price up. Let's get back to basics, where I started with this speech. Let's stop lazy and dishonest Liberal Labor government. Let's get back to basics. Restore affordable energy to increase take-home pay, usable pay, discretionary pay. Let's restore access to water. Let's comprehensively reform tax so that it is once again fair and efficient. And let's cut immigration to put downward pressure on house prices. Let's, Mr. Acting Deputy President, restore our country's productive capacity. Lower house prices will follow and will be sustained. Thank you, Mr. Acting Deputy President.